The boy didn't even look up when he said it. He was leaning against the tailgate of a truck that cost more than most people's retirements, scrolling through something on his phone, and he said it the way you say something you've said so many times. It stopped being an opinion and became a fact. You carry around like a driver's license. Old guy's in lane 7 again. Brought the same boat anchor he had last month. Somebody should tell him the Korean War ended. The two men standing with him laughed. Not mean laughs, exactly. Just the easy, careless laughter of people who have never had anything handed to them that they didn't deserve, and so they assume the same is true of everyone else. The old man in lane 7 didn't look up either. His name was August Eldon Mack, and he was 73 years old, and he had heard the boy the same way you hear a screen door bang in the wind. You register it, you file it, and you go back to what you were doing. He set his rifle case on the bench and unlatched it with the particular slowness of a man who has long since made his peace with every important thing in his life, including time. If you have ever been written off because of your age, your tools, or the quiet way you carry yourself, stay with this story. Because what happened at the Redstone Valley Bench Rest Club on a cold Saturday morning in October is the kind of thing that gets told for a long time afterward, and most of the people who tell it don't know the half of it. August Eldon Mack had driven down from the north end of the county in a 2003 Dodge with a cracked dashboard and a passenger seat that didn't go back all the way. He had left before sunup. He'd made a thermos of black coffee and drunk half of it by the time he crossed the county line, and then he'd driven the rest of the way in silence because the radio in the Dodge had stopped working in 2019 and he hadn't seen a reason to fix it. He was a tall man still, though the years had put a slight forward lean in him the way wind puts a lean in a fence post. His hands were large and steady, the knuckles thickened from cold and work, and the kind of life that doesn't offer gloves as often as it should. He wore a canvas jacket the colour of old pine needles, and his boots were laced exactly the same way they had been laced every morning for 40 years. He had been coming to the Redstone Valley Club for 3 years, ever since his wife passed and the house got too quiet on weekend mornings. Nobody there knew much about him. He paid his dues on time. He didn't talk much. He shot from lane 7 because lane 7 was at the end of the row and nobody crowded him there. The boy's name was Connor Hale, 26 years old. He had come up fast in the regional precision shooting circuit, the way certain people come up fast when they have talent and money and a temperament that reads confidence so well it's almost indistinguishable from the real thing until you look close. He shot for a manufacturer out of Colorado. He had a social media following somewhere north of 80,000 people. He was at Redstone Valley that morning to do a demonstration for a group of newer shooters who had paid $300 apiece to watch him work and ask him questions afterward, and he was the kind of person who filled a room with his own atmosphere before he even opened his mouth. The rifle he used was a thing of considered beauty. Chassis system machined from billet aluminum, carbon-wrapped barrel, caliber developed specifically for long-range work with a ballistic coefficient that let it resist when the way a boat bow resists a wake. The scope on it had a turret system that talked to an app on his phone, and the app talked to a Kestrel weather meter clipped to his shooting bag, and together they could spit out a firing solution in under 4 seconds that would have taken a trained man 20 minutes to work out with a pencil and a range card in 1968. August Eldon Mack's rifle was a Remington Model 40X built in 1963, walnut stock, single-shot bolt action, heavy barrel with a target crown. The scope on it was a fixed-power Unertl that had been mounted to the rifle since the Johnson administration and had not moved since. No app, no Kestrel, no turret clicks that could be translated into a phone notification, just glass and steel and wood and the man behind it. Connor Hale noticed the rifle the way you notice a cassette tape in an airport. He didn't say anything right away. He waited until he had his own equipment laid out and his paying students arranged in a loose semicircle around him, and then he looked down the line in the direction of lane 7 and said, loud enough that people 2 lanes over could hear him clearly, "If anyone's ever curious what we were working with before modern components made long-range shooting accessible to people who don't want to spend a decade doing math, lane 7's got a museum piece for reference." Some of the students laughed. A couple of them looked uncomfortable, the way people look when a joke lands wrong, but nobody wants to be the one to say so. August Mack adjusted his shooting rest half an inch to the right. He did not look up. The range officer that morning was a man named Dwight Polly, 58 years old. He'd been running the line at Redstone Valley for 11 years, since he came back from a contractor stint overseas that he didn't talk about in detail. He had a face that gave nothing away and a voice like a door hinge that needed oil, low and deliberate and not inclined toward wasted words. He had watched Connor Hale's comment travel down the line and arrive at lane 7, and he had watched August Mack not react to it, and something about that stillness made Dwight Polly pay attention. He'd seen August shoot before, 3 years of Saturday mornings. He knew the old man was good. He didn't know how good, exactly, because August had never once tried to demonstrate anything to anybody. The clinic began. Connor Hale was a legitimately skilled teacher, whatever else he was. He knew his material. He walked the students through position fundamentals, through the relationship between muzzle velocity and time of flight, through the way wind at the firing point was different from wind at 500 yards, and different again at 1,000, and through the way modern equipment could close the gap between what a shooter knew in theory and what he could execute under pressure. It was good information delivered well, and August Mack sat at lane 7 and listened to all of it with his hands folded on the bench in front of him and his rifle still uncased. The steel targets at Redstone Valley that day were set at 3 distances: 300 yards, 600 yards, and 1,000 yards. The 1,000-yard target was an 18-inch plate, which at that distance subtends to roughly 1.7 minutes of angle, small enough that wind errors of even a few miles per hour will push a bullet clean off the edge. Connor Hale worked his students up the distances. He was efficient about it. He hit the 300-yard target 4 consecutive times with a cadence that barely allowed for reloading, and his students were suitably impressed. At 600, he demonstrated the effect of a crosswind by showing them a miss, explaining exactly why it had missed before the bullet even landed, and then correcting and hitting. At 1,000 yards, he fired 3 shots and hit 2 of them, which is honest work on a cold morning with winds that hadn't made up their minds about anything all day. He turned to his students after the 3rd shot and said, "That's the ceiling for most shooters on a day like today without a support system. Wind's variable, mirage is moving, and your firing solution is only as good as your last reading. You hit 2 out of 3 at 1,000 in these conditions. You're doing something right." He said it the way a person says a thing when they believe it completely and have never been given a reason not to. August Mack had been watching the flags. Redstone Valley had wind flags set at 200, 500, and 800 yards. They were the standard 3-inch nylon streamers on 4-foot poles, and in the 2 hours since the clinic began, they had not agreed with each other once. The flag at 200 was mostly calm, occasionally twitching west. The flag at 500 was doing something irregular and irritating, cycling between a gentle push from the northwest and a harder shove from the west that came in gusts you could almost time. The flag at 800 had been honest all morning. It was moving steadily from the west, at what August estimated at 11 miles an hour, with variations that ran from 8 to 14 and averaged out around 10.5 if you watched it long enough and didn't rush the average. He'd been watching it long enough. He'd been watching the mirage too. The heat shimmer off the asphalt access road that ran between the 500 and 800-yard marks was leaning steadily, leaning in a direction that told a man who knew how to read it things the flags couldn't, because flags measure wind at the flag, and mirage measures wind in the air between the flag and the target, which is where the bullet actually goes. He licked the pad of his thumb and held it up. An old gesture, the oldest gesture, the gesture that Connor Hale's students had probably seen in photographs but never expected to see performed in front of them in the present tense. One of them actually raised his phone and took a picture, not mockingly. He didn't know what he was looking at yet, but something in the deliberateness of the gesture made him want to record it. August Mack lowered his hand. He reached into the breast pocket of his canvas jacket and took out a small notebook. It was a pocket-sized green notebook, the kind that used to come standard in a field gear list and that you could still buy at any military surplus store for $1.50. The cover was soft with use. He opened it to a page near the back and wrote something with a pencil stubs he pulled from the same pocket. 3 numbers. He looked at them for a moment. He erased the second one and wrote a different number. He looked at that for a moment longer. He put the notebook away. He put the pencil away. He opened the rifle case and lifted out the 40X and set it on the rest. Connor Hale was answering a question from one of his students about reticle subtensions when he noticed what was happening in lane 7. He finished his answer and then drifted a few steps down the line, the way you drift towards something that's pulled your attention without you quite deciding to let it. The old man's rifle was pointed at the 1,000-yard target. "Sir," Connor Hale said, and the word was careful, not cruel, not yet. Just careful in the way of a man who has cultivated a public persona and doesn't want to be seen being cruel on camera because 3 of his students had their phones out. "That's a vintage target rifle. Single shot, fixed power optic. Wind today's been in double digits most of the morning. You sure you want to?" "I'd like to try the 1,000, August Mack said. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken all morning. His voice was low and unhurried. The voice of a man who has long since stopped feeling the need to fill silences because he's lived through enough silence that it doesn't threaten him anymore. Dwight Polly had walked down to lane 7. He stood behind August's bench with his arms folded and his eyes moving between the old man and the young one. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His presence was the permission. Connor Hale stepped back. He said to no one and everyone, "Voltage equipment, variable wind. This should be instructive." He said it to give himself an exit. If the old man missed, which he would, it would be a teaching moment about the limitations of outdated tools. If the old man somehow hit, he could frame it as luck. Either way, Connor Hale remained the authority. That was the math he did in about 2 seconds, and it was the kind of math that confident 26-year-olds do without knowing they're doing it. August Mack did not rush. He settled into the rifle in the particular way of a man who has settled into it 10,000 times, not with effort but with recognition. The way you recognize the weight of a tool that has been yours long enough to feel like an extension of your own arm. He put his cheek on the stock and his eye to the scope, and he was still. He watched the flags again. He watched the mirage. He breathed. He made 2 clicks on the elevation turret of the Unital. Old machined clicks, each one worth a quarter minute, the sound of them mechanical and precise, and nothing like the digital adjustments on Connor Hale's setup. He looked through the scope once more. He made 1 additional click. He looked again, and this time he did not look away. The students had stopped asking questions. Dwight Polly had not moved. Connor Hale, without quite deciding to, had taken 1 more step back. August Mack breathed out. Halfway through the exhale, between 1 heartbeat and the space, before the next one, he pressed the trigger. The 40X made a sound unlike any of the rifles around it. It was clean and deep and unhurried, an older sound, a more deliberate sound of something engineered before the age of concussive volume and treated accordingly. The bullet was in the air for what seemed to everyone watching like an unreasonable amount of time. One of Connor Hale's students was about to say something. He drew breath for it. He did not exhale. The 18-inch plate at 1,000 yards rang. It didn't fall. It rocked on its carrier chain and then steadied, and the sound of it reached the firing line just over a second after the shot, clear and flat across the cold morning air, the sound a bell makes when struck by something that knew exactly where to find it. Nobody cheered, and that silence, that particular held silence, was different from the silence that had preceded the shot. The shot had been quiet concentration. What followed the shot was something else. A stillness that moves through a group of people when they've just seen something they didn't have a category for. Connor Hale was looking through his spotting scope. He took his eye away from it. He put it back. He took it away again. One of his students said very quietly, "Did he?" "Yeah," said the student next to him. Dwight Polly unfolded his arms. He walked to lane 7 and stood beside August Mack's bench and looked at the rifle and looked at the old man, who had not moved from behind the gun yet, who was still watching the target through his scope with the quiet attention of a man confirming something he already believed. "Mr. Mack," Dwight said. August Mack lifted his head. He ejected the spent case and set it on the bench beside the rifle and straightened up slowly with the particular effort of a man whose back had been having a conversation with him all morning. "Good shot," Dwight Polly said. August Mack nodded once. Conditions were honest. It was exactly the kind of thing he would say. Dwight Polly understood it completely and said nothing, because what was there to say? Connor Hale came down to lane 7. He came the way a person comes when they're not sure yet what shape the conversation is going to take. He stopped at a respectful distance, further back than he'd stood when he'd made his comment about museum pieces, further back than he might have intended, because something about the way the old man was standing held him there. I have to ask, Connor Hale said. Wind was 7 to 11 coming from 2 directions. No wind meter, no shooting app, fixed magnification. How did you hold for that? August Mack looked at him for a moment before answering. Not a hostile look. An assessing look, the look of a man deciding how much of an answer is actually being requested versus how much is being performed. Same way I always have, August said. And how is that? You watch the air long enough, it tells you. You don't watch the flags. Flags are what the wind was at the flag. Mirage is what the wind is doing to the bullet's path. Those are 2 different conversations. You want to win the argument, you have to be in the right one. One of Connor Hale's students wrote that down, on paper, with a pen. August Mack noticed this, and something in his face shifted, barely, in the direction of something like warmth. A truck had pulled up on the range road while they were talking. Nobody had heard it come in. It had arrived in that particular way. Vehicles arrive when your attention is entirely elsewhere. It was a late model pickup, plain, no stickers, and the man who got out of it walked with the straight-backed deliberateness of someone for whom correct posture stopped being an effort a long time ago and became simply the way the body held itself. He was in his mid-60s. He wore a plain grey jacket and carried nothing. He stood at the edge of the covered firing line and looked down the row of lanes until he found lane 7, and then he walked to it. Dwight Polly saw him coming and recognized him before he was close enough to speak to. His name was Frank Gideon Searle. He had been the chief instructor at the USMC Scout Sniper School for 9 years before he retired. He had written 2 chapters of the manual these kids had studied. His name appeared in footnotes. His methods were taught at 3 different military shooting schools. He was not famous in the way celebrities are famous, but in this specific world, in this specific discipline, walking in the direction of Frank Gideon Searle was like walking toward a reference book that could answer questions nobody had thought to ask yet. He had driven 40 minutes because Dwight Polly had sent him a text message 50 minutes ago that said, "Old man in lane 7, Remington 40X, fixed unertal, just called his wind on a cold bore 1,000-yard shot without a meter. You might want to see this." Frank Searle walked past Connor Hale without acknowledgement. He stopped at August Mack's bench and looked at the rifle for a long time. He picked it up, carefully, the way you pick up a thing you suspect has weight beyond its physical weight, and he turned it over and looked at the serial number stamped into the receiver. He set it down. He looked at the unertal scope on top of it. He looked at the adjustment knobs. He looked at where the front mounting ring sat. "There's a scratch on the left side of the objective bell," Frank Searle said. His voice was even. "Horizontal. About an inch long, looks like contact with something hard. Metal." He looked up at August Mack. August Mack was very still. "I saw a rifle like this once," Frank Searle said. 23rd Marines. There was an instructor. I was a young shooter, this was 1982, who used to make us read wind with a scope that hadn't been re-zeroed in 15 years, just to teach us that the equipment wasn't the limitation. He said a man who needed a perfect tool to do good work was a man who hadn't finished learning yet. He had a rifle with a scratch on the scope. He paused. I always figured that rifle went with him. The firing line was quiet in the way firing lines get when nobody is paying attention to safety rules because everyone is paying attention to something else. August Mack looked at the scratch on the scope. He hadn't looked at it in years. It was the kind of thing you stopped seeing on a thing you'd looked at every day for long enough. "He didn't take it with him," August said. "He made me take it." Frank Searle's face changed. It didn't collapse. It didn't break. It did the thing that faces do when something arrives that they have been half expecting for a long time without knowing they were expecting it. When a question that has been living as background noise suddenly becomes the only sound in the room. "Staff Sergeant August Mack," Frank Searle said. It wasn't a question. "Gunnery Sergeant," August said quietly. "I made it eventually." "You were with 3rd Battalion," Frank Searle said. "There was an engagement at a place that isn't in any of the official records I was ever given access to. Everything I know about it came second-hand from a single debrief that I wasn't in the room for. They told me the shooter came back. They told me the instructor didn't." August Mack put his hand on the rifle. Not to pick it up, just to put his hand on it, the way you put your hand on something that is partly a tool and partly a person you have been carrying for a long time. "His name was Garrett," August said. "Not a rank I'll say out loud today, because that's not how I think of him. He was 22. He had a way of reading conditions that I have spent 40 years trying to teach to other people, and I'm still not sure I ever got it right. He could stand in a field and tell you what the wind was going to do 30 seconds before the flags showed it. He said it was just pattern recognition. He said if you watched long enough, you stopped seeing data and started seeing intention. He stopped. The students were not on their phones anymore. Connor Hale had his cap in both hands, turning it slowly by the brim in a circle, the way hands seek something to do when a person has gone very quiet inside. There was a day, August said. We were in a position that had been a good position when we took it and was a bad position by the time we needed to use it. Our communication was gone. There was a long shot that needed to be made, and I needed a wind call I could trust, and Garrett gave it to me. He gave me the call and the shot was good, and then he did something I told him not to do, and that I have spent every day since then knowing why he did it, even though knowing why doesn't do what you think it will do. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Dwight Polly had stepped back. He had his head down and his hands behind his back, and he was looking at the ground with the focused attention of a man examining something very closely at his feet. Frank Searles said, after a moment, "He's in the doctrine." "I know," August said, "not by name." The debrief called him the spotter. But the technique, the way he characterized mirage movement as intentionality rather than data. I put that in the manual in 1989. It's been taught at 3 schools. Probably to 8,000 or 9,000 people by now. Frank Searle paused. I never knew what to put in the margin where a name should go. Connor Hale had taken another step back, and another, until he was at the edge of the covered line, and he was holding his cap at his side like a man at a graveside, who is not sure he belongs there, but knows enough to understand he should stay quiet. One of his students, a young woman who had not said anything in the last 15 minutes, raised her hand partway and then put it down. What was his full name, she asked. She asked it the way people ask things they're not sure they have the right to ask, quietly and to the air in front of her as much as to the old man, because she understood on some instinct that this question was different from a question about ballistic coefficients or trigger pull weights. August Mack looked at her. "Garrett James Whitlow," he said. "He was from a small town in eastern Tennessee. I couldn't find on a map if you gave me an hour. He talked about the mountains, the way people talk about someone they love, like they were always half in the conversation with him. He was 22 years old, and he knew things about wind and patience, and the relationship between the two that I am still, at 73 years old, still learning." He stopped. His jaw worked once. He had a younger brother back home, 14 when it happened. I wrote the family a letter. It came back unopened. The address didn't exist anymore. I tried twice more over the years, and eventually I stopped trying, which is a thing I live with. There was a phone buzzing somewhere. Nobody looked at it. Dwight Polly raised his head. He had been at the edge of the covered line, and now he walked back toward lane 7, and his face had an expression on it that was difficult to name, the expression of a man in the process of understanding something that is rearranging the order of other things he thought he understood. "Mr. Mack," he said. His voice was careful. "I need to ask you something, the letter you sent. What was the family's name?" August Mack looked at him, said, "Margaret Whitlow, the mother. I wrote to her twice at an address in a town called Calhoun, and then once more to a forwarding address in Knoxville that someone at the Veterans Office gave me in 1991. None of them came back the third time, so either the address was wrong or she read it and didn't answer." Dwight Polly was very still. "My wife's maiden name was Whitlow," he said. "Her mother was Margaret. She grew up in Calhoun, Tennessee. She moved to Knoxville in 1989. A pause. He was building towards something and seemed to understand there was no way to arrive at it gently. "Her brother died in service before she was born. She grew up with a name and a photograph and a folded flag. She never met a person who had been with him. The October air on the firing line was cold and still and smelled like gunpowder and dry grass." August Mack looked at Dwight Polly for a long time. "Your wife," August said. It was barely a question. "She passed 3 years ago," Dwight said. "Cancer. But she has a daughter, our daughter. She's 28. Her name is Garrett." He stopped. His voice had developed something in it, a roughness that hadn't been there before. "We named her Garrett because her mother wanted the name to keep going." The name sat in the air. August Mack's hand was on the rifle. His eyes were somewhere past the 1,000-yard target, somewhere out in the direction the bullet had gone, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has arrived, after a very long and circular journey, at a place he didn't know he was traveling toward. "I drove 45 minutes this morning," August said quietly. "I do every Saturday. I came because the house is quiet on weekends. I came because this is the one place where—" He stopped. He started again. "I come here because I don't know how to stop coming. I don't know how to stop doing the thing he taught me. It would feel like forgetting him, and I have never once been willing to do that." Dwight Polley crossed the firing line. No one stopped him. It is a rule that you don't cross a hot firing line, but there are rules, and then there are moments when the line between things that matter becomes clearer than all the other lines, and this was that. He stood in front of the old man. He didn't say anything. He put out his hand. August Mack took it, and they stood there for a moment on the Lane 7 bench, two men who had both spent decades carrying the same absence, without knowing the other was carrying it too, and the old Remington was between them on the rest. And that was right, because the rifle had been there as long as either of them had been carrying anything. Frank Searle had come to attention. He was standing at the edge of the covered line with his feet together and his hands at his sides and his eyes forward, and after a moment he raised his right hand to his temple in the formal manner of a salute and held it there. He did not look self-conscious about this. He held it the way you hold a salute when you are not doing it for the person watching, but for the person who isn't there to see it. Connor Hale was at the back of the covered line. He had put his cap on and taken it off again, and now he was just holding it in both hands against his chest, and he was not saying anything, and the 80,000 people who followed him online were not in his thoughts at all, because some moments have a gravity that presses everything that normally seems large into a very small, very quiet place. One of his students was crying. She wasn't making a sound. The tears were just there, matter of fact, like weather. The flags at 200, 500, and 800 yards moved steadily from the west, and at 1,000 yards the still swaying steel plate caught the morning light and threw it back at them in a slow and rhythmic pulse, a pendulum returning to rest. Garrett James Whitlow had been 22 years old, and he had called a wind for August Mack 49 years ago, and he had been right. The way he was always right. The way he was right because he didn't trust the flags. He trusted the air between the flags, which is where the truth actually lives. His name is in a manual. It is not in the margin where it belongs, because the man who wrote the manual never had a name to put there, but has been taught to thousands of people who are standing on firing lines right now, in the cold, reading the air, learning to tell the difference between what the flag shows and what the wind means. And every Saturday morning, an old man drives 45 minutes in a truck with a busted heater to lane 7 at a range in a valley, and he puts his cheek on a walnut stock that was built the year Kennedy was inaugurated, and he watches the flags until he stops seeing flags and starts seeing something else. And he makes the shot. He makes it the way you light a candle. He makes it because the one way he knows to keep Garrett James Whitlow in the conversation is to prove one more time that what Garrett gave him was true, that the flags lie, that the air tells the truth, and that a man who learned to listen to the right things from the right person carries that person with him everywhere he goes, even when he thinks he's going alone. If anyone ever handed you something, a skill, a lesson, a way of seeing the world, that you've carried without knowing how to put down, type it in the comments. Because the ones who taught us best are usually the ones we never got to thank. Subscribe to Echoes of Valor because we keep these names alive here, one story at a time, for as long as we have a line to shoot and air worth reading.